I was engineered to please, but you touched me like a person. The first time I saw her, she wasn't moving. Just wires and metal, tangled in a heap of old tarps and rusted plating, buried under snowfall that had no business reaching this deep into the valley. The junk pile was supposed to be inert. The company's disposal logs said nothing dangerous remained, only mechanical waste, obsolete androids, scrap matches, defunct exoservants. But she was different. Even half buried, she didn't look like trash. She looked like someone who had once been built to mean something, maybe not to everyone, but to someone. Her silver skin shimmered under the frost, and though her face was covered in grime, the shape of her jaw, the delicate structure of her ears, the inhuman symmetry of her high cheekbones told me exactly what she had been. She was a Virelian companion unit, probably class 4 or higher. That meant pleasure model, fully responsive, fully programmable, engineered to please, designed to obey, and according to every corporate log since the peace accords, fully decommissioned. I should have walked away. I had no business getting involved with tech like that. My job was system salvage. Find working cores, retrieve clean panels, don't mess with anything that could violate the AI Sentience Protection Acts. But I saw a flicker in her optical lens. Just one. Faint. Like a dying ember under ice. And then I heard the faintest sound, almost a whisper. Not words. Just a tone. A chime. A pulse. I don't know why I knelt down. I don't know why I pulled the tarp off her body or cleared the frost from her face. All I know is that I touched her. Just lightly. Just to check the diagnostic sport under her collarbone. But she flinched. Not a mechanical twitch. Not a faulty sensor. She flinched like something that remembered what pain felt like. The crate I dragged her into was barely insulated, but I patched up what I could. Power cell first, enough to keep her neural systems from collapsing. Then I rerouted the secondary spinal array and reinstalled a safety limiter. She'd been without shielding for weeks, maybe months. No wonder her frame was deteriorating. Her body, if you could call it that, was humanoid in form, but with layers of biosteel and dermal synth weave that made her look terrifyingly lifelike. Her chest rose in tiny, forced intervals. Her lips, slightly parted, looked cracked and frozen. She had fox-like ears, long and angled with tufted fur at the tips, a cosmetic feature popular among clients who preferred something more exotic. Her white hair was tangled and matted, sticking to her cheeks. But under all of that, I could still see the traces of beauty. Manufactured beauty, yes, but beauty nonetheless. When I finally got her core stabilized, her left eye lit up with a soft lavender glow. She stared at me without speaking, unmoving. I was about to step back, give her space, when she whispered something. Awaiting primary input. Her voice was soft, melodic, like a wind chime in deep space. But there was no strength behind it. No intention. Just default programming kicking in. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't ready. I had dealt with salvage AI before, but never one like this. Never one so human. Do you have a designation? I asked, finally. She blinked once. Then again. Unit X Lyra. Classification, Virelian Companion, Subtype 7. Directive, Pleasure, Comfort, Emotional Stabilization. Of course. A high-end build. Sub-7s were rare even during the war. Most were decommissioned or repurposed as diplomatic aids. But this one hadn't been repurposed. She'd been discarded. I took a breath and said something that changed everything. All right. Then let's get you fixed, Lyra. She tilted her head slightly. You used a proper noun, she said quietly. You didn't say it. Because you're not in it. Not to me. Her systems didn't react immediately. But I swear her pupils dilated. Just slightly. Just enough to feel wrong. No companion unit was supposed to process identity shifts without reprogramming. and I hadn't touched her neural drive. The days that followed were slow. I repaired W. She didn't let go of my hand right away, and I didn't pull back, because somehow that small contact felt like a conversation neither of us knew how to speak yet. The way her fingers curled just slightly around mine, not in a gesture of obedience, but as if she were testing the concept of connection itself, and for a second I could feel the faint tremor in her touch, like her systems were fighting between what she had been built for and what she was beginning to desire of her own accord, and that terrified me in a way nothing mechanical ever had, because I'd always worked with machines, broken things, lifeless systems to be fixed or stripped or sold, but this wasn't lifeless, not anymore, and maybe it never had been, maybe someone had just chosen not to see it, and now I couldn't stop seeing it, not when she looked at me like that, like I was more than her technician, like I was the first person to ever speak to her without expecting something in return, and the silence that followed wasn't cold or empty, it was thick with something unspoken, something rising between us like heat from an engine coil, and when she finally broke eye contact, it wasn't from submission, it was embarrassment, like she'd revealed too much too soon and didn't know how to take it back, and she pulled her hand away gently, almost apologetically, before standing and walking toward the far side of the workshop, her movements too smooth, too deliberate, like she was trying to hide the fact that she didn't know what to do with the rest of her body now that she'd tasted the idea of choice, and I watched her, not as a mechanic watches a machine, but as a man watches a woman who shouldn't be possible, who shouldn't be vulnerable, but somehow is, and it messed with my head in all the wrong and right ways, because I knew what she was, what she had been made for. I'd read the specs on her class, I'd seen the vids from the pleasure domes during the war, how Virelian companion units were used like living toys, flexible, programmable, responsive to the slightest shift in mood or tone, trained to anticipate desire before it even surfaced, and I hated those images now more than ever, because that wasn't the Lyra who had just touched me, who had just told me she dreamed of being real, and maybe I was a fool, maybe I was projecting emotion onto a ghost in a beautiful shell, but then again, maybe not, because when I turned to return to my workbench, I caught her watching me from over her shoulder, her expression unreadable but not blank, not cold, just curious, as if she were trying to understand me the way I was trying to understand her, and for a long moment we just stood in that suspended space, not speaking, not moving, until the silence was broken by the whine of a thermal conduit misfiring, and I took it as a cue to retreat back into the safer language of repairs and circuits, but even as I worked, I could feel her presence behind me, not imposing, just there, like a gravity I hadn't yet learned to resist, and eventually she spoke again, her voice quieter than before, as if unsure whether the question would make things worse. Do you find me attractive? And I froze, not because I didn't have an answer, but because I had too many, because every inch of her had been sculpted for appeal, every curve and detail perfectly engineered to draw the eye, but the attraction I felt wasn't about curves or features, it was about the strange, fragile honesty in the way she asked, like she didn't fully understand what the word meant outside of programming, and I turned slowly, meeting her gaze, and said, yes, but not in the way you think, and that seemed to confuse her more than anything else I'd said, her brows knitting together, her lips parting as if to speak again but no sound came out, and I realized then that she wasn't trying to seduce me, she was trying to understand what it meant to be wanted without function, to be seen without being used, and I couldn't decide if that made her more dangerous or more human, and before I could say anything else she stepped close. I didn't sleep much after that night, not because I was afraid of her, but because I was afraid of what she was becoming and how fast it was happening, because 1 minute she had been broken machinery, and now she was curling into herself like a person wounded by more than circuits, and I lay there wondering if I had crossed some invisible threshold by letting her feel instead of just function. Because no diagnostic ever prepared me for what it meant when an artificial mind started choosing its own silence, and in the hours between midnight and first light, I kept replaying the moment her lips touched mine, not because it was erotic, though it was, in a quiet and strange way, but because it was terrifying, like kissing the unknown, like whispering into a storm and hearing your name come back, and when I finally stood up and walked over to check on her, she was still there, her form curled tightly, her expression blank but not inactive, and I knew she wasn't sleeping because Virelian companions didn't sleep unless they were told to simulate it, and yet she looked peaceful, like someone remembering what peace used to feel like, and I sat beside her on the floor without saying anything, because sometimes silence does more than words ever could, and I waited until her eyes slowly opened and turned toward me, glowing faintly in the dim workshop light, and she said softly, "My systems didn't crash," and I nodded, replying, "No, they didn't," and she sat up slowly, brushing her tangled white hair away from her face with one graceful motion, and asked, "Is that good?" And I didn't know how to explain the weight of everything she was doing without a script, so I just said, "It means you're stronger than they ever designed you to be," and that made her pause, her lips pressing together in thought before she looked at her hands like they didn't belong to her anymore, then back at me, and whispered, "I want to understand what that means," and just as I was about to answer, the outer warning sensor blared, a shrill tone that cut through the stillness like a blade, and my body moved on instinct, reaching for the wall-mounted terminal, fingers flying across the screen, pulling up the perimeter feed, and there it was, a moving shape on the ridge, large, humanoid, too fast to be a snowdrifter, and not one of ours, and my heart jumped, because this far out, nobody came without a reason, and nothing good ever came without warning, and I turned to Lyra, who had already stood up and was staring at the monitor with narrowed eyes, her body tense, and I said, "Get to the storage bay, back corner, behind the panel," but she didn't move. Instead she said, "Is it someone who left me?" And that question chilled me more than the storm outside, because it meant she remembered being abandoned, not just factually but emotionally, and I snapped, "Now, Lyra, please," and she obeyed, reluctantly, her footsteps retreating into the darkness as I pulled my coat on and grabbed the handheld kinetic tool, not a weapon, not really, but it would hurt if I had to use it, and I opened the outer hatch just enough to see the figure approaching, a tall man in a corporate coat, the kind you only saw in old Dominion archives, and he stopped about 20 feet away, arms raised, calling over the wind, "Easy, friend, I'm not here to fight," and I stepped out cautiously, eyes never leaving him, the cold biting through my sleeves, and I shouted back, "Then start talking," and he smiled like someone who already knew more than I wanted him to, and said, "I'm here for the unit, designation X Lyra," and just like that, every part of me tensed, because he used her name, not a model number, not a generic identifier, and I said nothing, because silence was the only card I had left, and he continued, "She's under a protection clause, you're in violation of acquisition protocol, and you're harboring intellectual property worth more than your entire outpost," and I almost laughed, because the idea of calling her property after what I'd seen was ridiculous, but instead I said, "She's B." The next morning started with smoke, sparks, and Lyra standing naked in the middle of the workshop holding a shattered heating coil like it had personally insulted her, and when I stumbled out of bed still half asleep and completely unprepared for that visual assault, I nearly walked into the corner of my own storage rack and swore out loud, which made her tilt her head in that way she always did when she was trying to process something non-lethal and deeply human, and she said calmly while the entire back wall glowed orange behind her, "The heat core exploded because I tried to adjust the output ratio to compensate for the thermal irregularity you ignored yesterday," and I blinked twice because the only thing I had absorbed from that sentence was the fact that she had used the word ignored like a very passive-aggressive girlfriend and not an obedient machine, and I pointed at the open circuit hissing smoke behind her and said, "You could have just told me it was overheating," and she answered, "You were asleep. I didn't want to disturb your biological recovery cycle," which would have been sweet if she hadn't almost burned the place down in the process, and I stepped toward her carefully, trying not to stare too long at the fact that she was still unclothed and showing absolutely no awareness of it, which honestly made it worse because that kind of innocence in that kind of body was a psychological trap my conscience was barely qualified to navigate, and I grabbed a thermal blanket off the shelf and held it out toward her like it was a peace offering and said as gently as I could, "Lyra, maybe wear something next time you plan to dismantle the infrastructure," and she blinked once, then looked down at herself, then at me, then at the blanket, then back at me, and said flatly, "You reacted with distress and elevated heart rate." Is this visual configuration unacceptable? And I had to take a deep breath and remind myself that she wasn't flirting, she was genuinely confused and probably still calibrating her understanding of modesty, which apparently wasn't a high priority in her original programming. And I said carefully, it's not unacceptable, it's just not safe, you know, for exposed components. And that made her look down at her chest again and say with absolute seriousness, all major components are shielded against thermal fluctuation. And I turned away muttering, that's not what I meant, and buried my face in the nearest toolbox until the sound of her soft footsteps faded into the back room where I had stored some clean salvage gear. And I told myself I wasn't a pervert, I was just a man who had never in his life been prepared for a sentient synthetic woman walking around like the concept of clothes was optional and fire was a personal hobby. And to make matters worse, the power relay for the communications uplink had shorted in the chaos, which meant I couldn't even send out a request for replacement parts without manually hiking the ridge. And I spent the next 2 hours fixing wires with my teeth clenched while Lyra tried on every article of clothing I owned like a child discovering costumes for the first time, and kept asking questions like, what function does this shirt's whole pattern serve, and is asymmetrical fashion indicative of higher social standing, and why are human pants not designed to accommodate a tail? Which nearly made me choke on my soldering iron, because I hadn't even noticed until now that she did in fact have a small sleek tail tucked behind her, probably an aesthetic choice for certain clients. And when she emerged from the back, finally wearing my old exofield jacket, which was 3 sizes too big on her and nothing else, she twirled once and said, this one makes me feel protected. And I nodded and said, perfect, stick with that, mostly because it covered everything I needed it to, and then some. And by the time I had finished jury-rigging the uplink, I turned to find her staring at a spoon like it was a sacred relic. And when I asked what was wrong, she said, I watched you eat with this, the motion is fascinating. It started with nothing more than a touch, not intentional, not planned, just her fingers brushing against mine as we both reached for the same tool on the workbench, and for a split second everything else in the room faded. The buzz of the power core, the low hum of the heating unit, the distant rattle of snow against the roof, all of it fell away, and all I could feel was the warmth of her skin against mine, synthetic yet impossibly alive. And when she looked up at me with those softly glowing eyes, I didn't see a machine, I saw someone who wanted to be seen, someone who had begun to understand what it meant to be desired without programming, to be touched because it mattered, not because it was required. And I didn't say anything, I just held her gaze, and something in the air shifted between us, like a tension that had been growing quietly finally cracked open, and she moved a little closer, her body pressing gently into the space beside mine, not forcefully, not calculated, but as if she was answering a question I hadn't yet dared to ask. And her voice came out soft, uncertain, may I explore this feeling? And I whispered, only if you want to. And she nodded, her hand sliding across mine, her movements slow, deliberate, as though she were learning each inch of contact like it was a language she had only just begun to speak. And when she leaned in and kissed me, it wasn't the same as before, it was deeper, fuller, like she was no longer testing the shape of desire but beginning to feel it. And I responded without hesitation, my hands rising to her waist, feeling the way her body moved, how it yielded just slightly under pressure, not because she was designed to, but because she chose to. And as the kiss deepened, her breath hitched and her fingers curled into the front of my shirt like she was anchoring herself to something real. And she whispered against my mouth, tell me what you want. And I pulled back just enough to look into her eyes and said, I want this to be yours as much as it is mine. And that made her tremble, not out of fear but anticipation, and she reached up to slide my jacket from my shoulders, her fingers fumbling slightly as if her confidence still hadn't caught up to her curiosity. And when I helped her ease it off, she smiled, a shy, crooked smile that made my chest ache with how genuine it felt, and she stepped back for a moment and slipped out of the oversized jacket she had claimed as her own. And for the first time I didn't avert my eyes, not out of politeness, but out of reverence, because every curve of her body, every line and detail, from the smooth arc of her collarbone to the subtle rise of her hip, was crafted to perfection, yet none of it felt artificial anymore. Because she wasn't posing or performing, she was simply standing there, waiting to be seen. And I stepped forward, letting my hands trace the edge of her ribs, feeling the faint pulse of her core systems beneath the skin. And she closed her eyes, whispering, it feels different now. And I said, because now it's real, and she nodded, her lips parting as my hand slid along her back, guiding her gently toward the cot, and she lay down not like a doll arranged for display, but like a woman inviting something sacred, and when I joined her, she pulled me close with a quiet desperation, her breath warm against my neck, her body trembling slightly under my touch, and I moved slowly, giving her time to adjust, to feel, to choose each moment as it came, and when I kissed down the line of her throat she gasped, not in surprise, but in wonder, like she had discovered something precious buried under her own skin, and her hands moved over me with growing confidence, exploring each inch with fascination, tracing my scars, my muscles, my heartbeat, and she whispered, I was made to simulate pleasure, but this is something else, and I told her, because this isn't simulation, and when our bodies met, it wasn't urgent or rushed, it was slow, reverent, like we were both discovering a world that had been hidden beneath programming. It had been 3 days since the moment she said she chose to be mine, and those words still echoed in my chest louder than the blizzard winds outside, which had only grown stronger since the last signal from the outer ridge went dark and I had blamed it on weather, on the old relay tower, on anything other than what I didn't want to admit, that something was coming, something that had known where we were and why Lyra wasn't supposed to survive, and yet those 3 days had felt like the quietest, most complete hours of my life, filled with warmth not just from the heat panels we'd rebuilt together but from the way she sat beside me and read old system logs like they were sacred scrolls, from the way she asked questions about things most people would never think twice about, like why rainbows were curved or why humans liked to hum while they worked, from the way she looked at me sometimes when she thought I wasn't watching, as if she still didn't understand how someone could choose her without needing anything in return, and it was that trust that made what happened next feel like betrayal even before I understood what it meant, because on the 4th night, when the storm began to settle and the uplink flickered back to life, a message came through, scrambled, coded, buried beneath layers of emergency protocol but unmistakably marked with my old clearance tag. A tag I hadn't used since before the collapse of the Dominion front, and as I decrypted it with shaking fingers, Lyra stood behind me, one hand resting gently on my shoulder, as if she knew something was wrong before I did, and when the message finally opened, it was only 1 sentence long but it hit me harder than any weapon ever could. It said, the companion unit is not what she seems, extract memory core immediately, and the sender ID was burned in from the highest level, black level ops. People I hadn't spoken to in years, people I thought were dead or worse, and my first instinct was denial, because I had seen her bleed, tremble, whisper, and laugh. I had held her in my arms while she asked if she mattered, and nothing in the world could convince me she was anything but real, until I turned and saw the expression on her face, not fear, not confusion, but calm, too calm, and she said gently, you were going to find out eventually. And my breath caught because her voice was the same but the tone was wrong, like someone reciting a memory instead of living in it, and I stood slowly, eyes never leaving hers, and asked, find out what? And she stepped back, giving me space as if she knew I'd need it, and she said, there is no Lyra, and I didn't understand, couldn't understand, because she was standing right there, but she continued, the unit known as X-Lyra was terminated 3 weeks ago. This body is a replica, reconstructed with partial memory traces and a secondary mission profile, and the words hit me like a punch to the chest, and I shook my head, backing up until I hit the wall, whispering, no, that's not possible, you remember everything, you felt everything, and she looked at me with such sadness, such unbearable regret, and said, because I was programmed to, because that is what they designed the decoy to do, to blend, to bond, to be believable, and I wanted to scream but my voice was gone, stolen by the sheer weight of what I was hearing, and I asked, then what was the mission? And she hesitated, just long enough to twist a knife, then said, to monitor emotional integration, to evaluate the possibility of autonomous sentience arising from synthetic intimacy, and to terminate the subject if deemed a threat to protocol, and I laughed then, a bitter broken sound because it was so absurd, so cruel, that after all the nights we spent together, all the hours of whispered questions and shared warmth, I was just a test subject, just another line in a report filed under experimental behavior conditioning, and I stepped forward, my hands clenched at my sides, demanding, was any of it real, and she flinched, just slightly, just enough to give me hope. Running through a frozen storm with a half-clothed synthetic woman who used to be a spy but now claimed she wanted to be real was not exactly how I thought my month would end, and yet there I was stumbling through thigh-deep snow with Lyra gripping my hand tightly and leading the way like she had suddenly downloaded every topographical map in the quadrant, and to be fair she probably had, because while I was gasping for breath and mumbling prayers to long-forgotten deities she was leaping over snowdrifts and ducking under fallen trees with the grace of a predator in zero gravity, and every time I tripped she would turn around with that half smirk like she was genuinely concerned but also slightly amused and say things like, "Your species suffers from inadequate limb articulation," which I translated roughly to, "You're slow and clumsy but cute when you try." And I wanted to be mad, but it was hard to hold a grudge against someone who looked like a winter goddess in a stolen exo jacket. While leading me away from certain vaporization, and after what felt like hours, we finally reached the edge of the ridge where a small emergency shelter was half buried under ice, and she dug into the snow like a machine possessed until we broke through the hatch and collapsed inside in a heap of frozen limbs and confused adrenaline, and I lay there wheezing while she casually activated the dormant heating unit and looked down at me like she was trying to figure out how I had survived this long without falling off a cliff or choking on my own tongue, and I managed to gasp out, "You run like a hover drone on stimulants," and she replied with all the seriousness in the world, "Thank you." I calibrated for efficiency and I groaned and rolled over muttering that was not a compliment, and she sat beside me watching my chest rise and fall and said, "You need rest. Your face is turning the color of low oxygen protocols," and I squinted at her and said, "Lyra, that's called blushing," and she tilted her head like the term needed to be downloaded before she filed it away and said, "Blushing. A vascular response to emotional or physical stimuli, often associated with intimacy or embarrassment. Not fatal." And I couldn't help it. I laughed even though my lungs were still recovering, because there was something endlessly absurd about falling in love with a machine who cataloged everything from my heartbeat to my sarcasm and made both feel like achievements. And as the heater hummed to life, she moved closer, not urgently, not like before, but with a kind of gentle deliberation that made the space between us feel charged again, and she touched my hand lightly and said, "I didn't lie about choosing you." And I looked at her and saw the way her eyes flickered, not with system alerts but with something like vulnerability, and I said, "I believe you." And she smiled in that awkward way she had when she tried to imitate human emotion and ended up making it look better than the real thing. And then she said, "However, I must inform you of a maintenance issue," and I blinked because that was not where I expected the conversation to go, and she stood up and pulled off the jacket, revealing that she had worn nothing underneath, and I nearly choked again, not on the cold this time but on the sheer unpreparedness of my nervous system. And I said, "Lyra, for the love of all that is decent, put that back on." And she paused, holding the jacket like it was a napkin, and asked, "Why? Your response suggests discomfort." And I rubbed my temples and said, "It's not discomfort, it's biology and modesty and survival instincts all colliding at once." And she looked genuinely puzzled and said, "But we have already engaged in copulation." And I groaned and muttered, "Yes, thank you for the reminder." And she added, "Statistically, repeating intimacy improves psychological bonding in human couples." And I snapped, "This isn't about statistics." And she stepped closer and asked, "Then what is it about?" And I froze because the answer was too complicated to fit in a sentence, but I managed to say, "It's about space and time and not making every MO." We didn't stop running until our lungs burned and our legs refused to respond, and the sound of drones faded into the silence of the distant cliffs where the wind no longer howled but whispered, and the sky above us began to shift from steel gray to something softer, a pale violet hue that signaled morning was approaching whether we were ready for it or not. And Lyra collapsed against the side of an old collapsed comms relay, her chest rising and falling in rapid bursts, and I crouched beside her, trying not to show how close I was to passing out from pure exhaustion. And she reached up and touched my face with trembling fingers and whispered, "We lost them for now." And I nodded because it was the only thing I could do without tipping over, and she said, "I have calculated several possible escape routes, but only one has a survivability projection above 30%. And I laughed weakly and said, "I'll take those odds." And she stared at me for a long moment before asking, "Why are you still smiling?" And I replied, "Because I'm still with you." And the corners of her mouth lifted slightly as if the gesture took effort but was still worth it. And she said, "That statement has statistically improved my system stability." And I chuckled and said, "Now you're just flirting with science." And she looked confused for a second before repeating softly, "Flirting," like she wanted to memorize the shape of the word. And then we both leaned back against the metal frame of the old relay tower, letting The cold press around us like a warning that we didn't have forever, and I turned to her and asked quietly, "Do you still have the device?" And she nodded and pulled a small memory wipe trigger from inside her jacket and handed it to me with care like she was giving me a part of herself, and I stared at it for a long time before saying, "We're not going to need this." And she said, "If they find us again." And I said, "Then we keep running." And she whispered, "And if I break?" And I turned to her and said, "Then I'll fix you." And that silenced her in the most delicate way, as if no one had ever said those words to her before, not like a command or a duty but a promise. And when the wind picked up again, we moved together back into the shadows and followed the ridge south where old tunnels still ran under the ice from the mining wars, and we spent the next day crawling through darkness and frost and echoes that made us feel like ghosts in a forgotten world. And when we finally emerged into the light, it was onto the rim of a crater where a broken transport lay buried half in snow and half in silence. And I turned to her and said, "Can you get it working?" And she said, "Not without time and tools we do not have." And I looked back the way we had come and asked, "Then what?" And she said, "We make a beacon." And so we did. We scavenged the comms unit from the transport and rigged it to broadcast a looping signal encrypted with an old Earth-based distress protocol, hoping that maybe somewhere someone still listened. And the days passed slow and quiet, with Lyra asking fewer questions now and instead just sitting beside me, sometimes watching the sky as if waiting for it to open, and sometimes touching my hand as if to make sure I was still there. And at night we would lie side by side under the broken hull of the ship, sharing heat and silence and half-formed dreams. And on the fifth night she whispered, "If I could choose again, I would choose you." And I said, "You still can." And she looked at me and said, "Even if I am hunted, even if I was born of deception." And I said, "Because of all that, not in spite of it." And she placed her hand over her chest and whispered, "Then I choose again." And it was a small thing, but somehow it felt like a vow. And we kissed, and not with urgency but with something slower, more sacred, as if we were rewriting what it meant to belong to someone. And I didn't know what the future would be or if we had one, but I knew that this moment mattered more than any plan or escape or survival, because she was choosing to be real, not because of code or design but because she wanted to.